really quite the series of specific COVID-19 and the dental office lease negotiations. The topic tonight is specifically around some of the mistakes and best practices we're seeing when doctors are preparing or are now reopening. So this is really about helping to make sure that you're not alone in all of this. And I know there's no shortage of webinars and other aspects going on right now. Obviously, our firm's pretty unique. We've been part of, Henry Schein has featured us as part of their COVID-19 resource center, as well as their practice recovery program. So we've been working with doctors really throughout the entire continent in the negotiations or renegotiations and dealing with landlords, dealing with rent abatements, deferrals, dealing with default notices, believe it or not, with many landlords these days holding dental tenants, hostage due to lack of a better word. And we're also seeing some trends throughout the country. We're seeing obviously some very unique concerns from doctors, concerned about, should I stay, should I go, should I walk away? I can't stand this PPE, I can't practice, and definitely having some very, very, very unique and in some cases, some very emotional conversations with doctors in pretty unique situations. So the purpose of tonight really is to help share what's working, what are some strategies, where are we at today, and how can we help to leverage the current situation to make things better for us. On the positive, we've been running these weekly, now bi-weekly, and continue to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of doctors continue to register. So we appreciate that as we continually update the content as each and every week we see us changing and upgrading. So just a quick little background, and then we're going to do some polling questions in a moment. So for those of you that have not heard of us before, we are the only healthcare tenant representation firm of our kind that is especially specialized on dental. We do some physicians and vets, but our core focus is dental. That's it. That's all we do. So very uniquely, right, is just focusing on the dental office lease. We were founded by dentists back 26 years ago and have since done over 12,000 successful lease negotiations. The structure, of course, is unique. So we have attorneys on staff. We have a lease negotiation team specifically, many of which have worked for landlords and national landlords. So we brought them on board. Instead of negotiating against the dentist, they're now negotiating for the dentist. Some on our negotiation team have been doing it now for over 17 years. So an incredible bench strength, an incredible track record. And with over 4.9 out of 5 of Google reviews, we consistently show and continually show that the tenant is one of the best tenants on the course of the earth and is also therefore have some of the highest leverage with the landlord. And amongst COVID, that has continually proven itself to be correct because of the fact that a lot of doctors now are becoming the new anchor tenants. Right, the gyms or the nail salons or the movie theaters or otherwise, right? They're the ones not paying rent. This is a perfect opportunity now that the dentist continues to prove that it continues to be one of the best tenants and therefore deserves some of the best leases, and to leverage that fact, both on the financials as well as all the business clauses as well. We represent hundreds of doctors every year throughout the continent, right? Just this past week, from Southern California to New Mexico to South Florida, throughout New York, a lot of New York lately as everyone's preparing to reopen, throughout the Midwest, all the way through to Spokane, Washington. I've been involved with personally. So getting a great cross section throughout, of course, throughout the country of Canada as well. So really looking forward to sharing a lot of that. We do a lot of these continuing education courses, and it is certainly a very unique time to be in the space. So a couple of interesting components here is these 85, 54, and 80. So these three numbers, what does that represent? Well, interestingly, right, these are some key stats we've tracked over the years and now continues to be more true than ever, which is 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. For those of you that have a digital copy of their lease, I'd highly suggest following along. We'll be highlighting a lot of specific clauses This particular one is referring to the assignment and subletting provisions within the lease that dictates the amount of control the landlord may have. In addition to that, 54% are overpaying in rent. And based on recent trends, which we'll touch on in terms of vacancies, rental rates, and otherwise months on market, this continues to be even more true than ever. And in addition to that, 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them the right to at least to 50% of the proceeds when the practice is sold. So the purpose of today. The purpose of today is a fewfold. Number one is we are now, for most, and we'll do a quick poll here, we are now in the process of reopening. And I think we can take, for the most part, a bit of a deep breath. So as we look to this, the poll just popped up. As we take a deep breath, let's look at a couple of questions. And we're going to customize tonight's content based on some of the situations and where we're at. So right now, if you can, note which country you're in, USA or Canada. Purpose of taking the course this evening. Is it general knowledge, looking for some specific guidance, needing some help with the lease? In addition to that, right, what's your reopening status? So let's share some of that. Those that have been open for weeks, just opened, reopening soon or not sure. What's your situation? A lot of doctors looking to buy or build and expand and take advantage of some of the pretty incredible opportunities out there. Number two is I'm thinking of selling and walking away, or I'm looking to stay put. And then from that perspective, again, looking at how to structure the plan for reopening, right? Great question is, how much leverage do I have? And some of that is predicated on your lease and the pending lease expiry. So from that, we'll take another 5 to 10 seconds here. If you can, just fill in a couple of those and we'll customize the content based on the group this evening and how we can help make sure that we're able to ensure that the lease does not impact, or the actions we're taking today with making changes and upgrades to the space and HVAC and separating people out and hours of operation, that it won't impact the lease. Okay, perfect. So again, purpose of tonight is, let's talk about the market trends. Here's what we're seeing. Here's what we're seeing from a shift from being landlord friendly to, in many parts of the continent, being a lot more tenant friendly now. In addition to that, we're going to showcase some of those mistakes when reopening. We're also going to talk about really a lot of the questions now, and some of the ADA statistics, if you've been following it, are pretty staggering. The one they did on June 1st showed that almost 25% of dentists polled as part of the ADA survey, almost 25% were looking to make a significant change, meaning either sell, bankruptcy, walk away, right, affiliate with the DSO, right? Or to simply change professions. So pretty staggering numbers based on the impact of COVID, especially those that have been contemplating transitioning, many of which I've had conversation with even today, just not sure if they're going to go back, if they're going to reopen, or what it's going to be like, and what the new normal is, and if it's worthwhile continuing. So we're going to touch on when and how. We're going to touch on some key things to look out for in the lease, specific clauses. So there'll be some good opportunities for some screenshots and some other aspects to be aware of. And then, of course, interactive Q&A. So I see a couple of questions are starting to come through. I would encourage you to feel free to post some of those questions, and we'll certainly cover those as we go through as it becomes relevant. In terms of the survey, great to see we've got a pretty clear mix between geography, lots looking for some general knowledge and improvements, a number of you with obviously some specific concerns with the lease. About 9% have been open for weeks, which is great. About 45% have just opened. In addition to that, another 27% are reopening very soon, and 18% are unsure. So very interesting. Actually, that's not too far off the ADA survey results. In terms of this, 18% looking to buy or build, another 18 thinking of selling and walking away. And the vast majority, of course, are looking to stay put, build, and expand on what we have today. So great. So that's a little bit of background in terms of the room. Initial question to cover through. My lease has expired 10 years ago and on a month-to-month basis. If the landlord's reluctant to renegotiate a new lease, what's the best approach? So I'm going to circle back on that, because in those scenarios, for those that are on the line in a month-to-month scenario, it does yield the largest risk. And it is actually one of the core components that we're going to touch on about how to address some of the mistakes. So let me circle back on that one for you. Okay. So now looking forward, so market trends. So here's what we're seeing. Rents, vacancies, months on the market, sales volume. We are just starting to see some of the core data on a month-over-month basis that shows a few things. Number one is that for the vast majority of the leases we're negotiating, we're pushing in for downward pressure on rents. Why? Because a lot of vacancies are there. A lot of landlords are becoming increasingly desperate to fill those vacant properties, especially those landlords and the smaller mom and pops that have heavily leveraged themselves, have their banks, knocking down their door, looking to potentially call loans or reviewing financials. And for many, their debt obligation and mortgage obligation is very high. They can't afford having 3, 4, or 5 different tenants not pay or short pay rent. In addition to that, obviously vacancies, for the most part, are going up. Just when our attorney was walking around the other day, he said on the walk through to the office, he counted nine default notices, taped to a tenant's door. Therefore, vacancies will be going up. And you might be wondering why. Why are landlords looking to do it? Well, a few reasons. Number one is redevelopment. And developers are looking for ways to acquire properties and grow and expand. In addition, in some cases, landlords have been wanting to have those tenants out or to change the tenant mix. In addition, they might feel that they're willing to hold on, or that they can get someone else in to pay a little more based on what was there. So there's a large number of reasons for that. Months on months, reviewed a few recently, it's up. So a lot of properties are staying on the market 3 to 4 months in addition, right? And based on the sales volume year over year, some markets have been down over 67% or more in terms of the amount of square footage that's changed hands. So ultimately, again, for those with leases and those that are tenants today, that can be a great thing because the pendulum is starting to shift back in your direction. So another couple of components here is that in many cases, landlords have offered some sort of deferral or abatement of rent, principally deferrals. We're seeing a lot of 3-month terms or otherwise. However, a lot of it is still outstanding, right? The landlord, the property manager said, yeah, pay me what you can. However, a lot of which has yet to be rectified, meaning that we may still be in default today, or we may still have some lingering issues that is still outstanding, or short payments in rent. In addition to that, renewals and new starts. So we are seeing a lot of doctors that look at this as a glass half full opportunity, meaning that if your lease is coming due in the next 2 years, for example, so approximately 55% of the people on the CE course this evening, the renewal is an unprecedented time to be leveraging with the landlord, because the landlord needs to recognize that revenue. And the cap rates, which you may have heard of, is very important. So long-term leases can be, again, a godsend for the landlord. So being able to renegotiate a lease about 2 or 2.5 years, or any time in between prior to expiry, we're seeing some fantastic leverage that landlords, for the most part, are very interested in or anxious to be renegotiating those leases. And of course, new starts, And relocations. We're seeing a whole other component that if the landlord's not willing to play ball and 22% of revenue is going towards tenancy expense, ladies and gentlemen, it is time to pull the Band-Aid and relocate. And I know that's what the last thing many of you are thinking of into this stage, but for the hundreds, if not thousands of doctors that we've helped relocate over the years, for most of them, they said it's the best thing they've ever done. So if you've been contemplating relocating, it might be an incredible time to do so. Okay, so let's jump into the top mistakes. And again, I encourage you to put in any Q&A if you have, based on your specific area, province or state, what you're seeing or any specific concerns you may be having. So the big one now is the COVID-19 and the alterations. And for those of you following along in your lease agreement, you want to be looking at the section entitled Alterations, the Alterations clause. This is relevant. What so many doctors are doing is a knee-jerk reaction. They're calling contractors, they're doing it themselves, they're calling their brother-in-law, whatever, to make changes to the space to try to get ready to reopen and be compliant and otherwise. However, be sure to understand what the rights and responsibilities are for you within the space. And for the most part, the vast majority of leases, well over 90%, you cannot make any changes, even some of the most basic cosmetic changes to the office without the landlord's prior written consent, which consent cannot be unreasonably withheld in some cases, but you still need written consent. So this can be a big problem, right? I've seen some doctors that have had their contractors come in, they've built walls, they have sectioned off the operatories, they've made changes to the HVAC equipment, all of which can be a major issue and can put you in default because the landlord, again, it's their space. And if you're making changes, that can have unintended impacts to airflow, that can have impacts to the fire code and the specific fire suppression strategy in the space. So that's why it's in there. It's not just for the landlord to be difficult. It's to ensure that it meets all the other specific requirements that you may not be aware of. So be very cautious, make sure the landlord's aware, and especially for drilling, if we're making specific changes, and we're making any significant alterations, even some basic ones, that's key. Doctor recently in the adjacent space, they had a bit of a right-of-way issue. They had to install a whole wall. Well, that wall, unfortunately, limited access for the wheelchair accessible patients. So as a result, then had to deal with the landlord and had to get a door installed to ensure that this was not going to impact. And that was the adjacent dentist. So again, these times have seen changes. Be aware. HVAC. Right? Do you have access to the HVAC? Right? What are we doing for the HEPA filters and the airflow? These type of things, especially with the HVAC, if you don't have access to the roof, if it's connected to an adjacent tenant, right? You might not even have access, and therefore something as silly as a locked door might be preventing you from reopening properly. In addition to that, the next big piece is the rent shortfall. So for many of you, have made all your rent obligations and you might have been late or otherwise, but it's since been resolved. Or let's say you made 2 or 3 payments, but are still short, or let's say haven't made June yet. So the rent shortfall is relevant for a few reasons. One is because it includes 2 different components. There's base rent and then the common area maintenance. Those are the 2 main elements, rent and additional rent, that we're responsible for. If we always advise, right, if you can pay the rent, pay it, right? If you've made the choice to not pay the rent, then there can be some leverage, but you want to be very careful because that can, again, make matters much worse, which we'll touch on in terms of now default. So default is a real risk that, unfortunately, many dentists have received notices of default for a variety of reasons, some of which is to a delinquency or a late payment in rent. So another question that just came in was, how do we tell, speaking of rent and base rent and common area increases, how can I tell if I am overpaying in rent according to the size of the office? So as an advantage for all those, not to give away the ending, but for the advantage of all those on the line, we will do a complimentary lease review and or a rental rate analysis. So we have all access to proprietary real estate reports throughout the continent to look at vacancies, demographics. So if you've had any questions, right, definitely there'll be an ability in the end to request a rental rate analysis, and we'll be able to assist where we can. But for those in default, and for those that may have received a default notice, this can create a cascading amount of events and make your reopening much worse. Number one is some late charges, that there can be interest or penalties incurred. Number two is accelerated rent. They may be able to ask for June, July, and August combined. In addition, they could ask for 3 months, depending on your lease, of increased security deposit immediately on top of the past due rent. Or last but not least, the landlord may have termination rights. And that, as you can imagine, you just get back in, you finally called all your staff, right? The staff who are making more on unemployment, don't get me started. We finally got everybody back in, we've got the band together, we're ready to go. The appointments are filled all the way through the summer. And now the landlord is going to throw us a slush ball and look to terminate the lease because of the impact of late payments or being in default. Now, you might think, oh, I haven't got anything, or my landlord's nice and they're not going to cause me any troubles. Well, again, review your lease. Determine if there is a notice or a cure period. Depending on your lease, you might not even know if you're still in default. The landlord might just keep that as a trump card and only come back and use that against you in the end. There was a doctor who reached out to us, gosh, probably a year and a half ago now. She was in a beautiful end cap, right, meaning in the corner, lots of natural light of a strip mall. She had built out a beautiful practice. 8 years in, she had sent out notice to exercise her option to renew the lease. She had been a perfect tenant. She paid all her lease on time. Everything was just right. She fixed her own plumbing. She was, again, the perfect tenant. When she submitted the option and her request to renew the option early, just as she should, the landlord wrote back and said, we found you in material default, and therefore you will not be able to stay in this space after the expiry, and therefore your remaining options, 2 5-year options, are now null and void. In the end, what it was, as we'll touch on, is within the specifics of the options were invalidated because they found her in material default. And that specifically was linked to a clause in the lease regarding the hours of operation. And it was a photo of her front door that the landlord used as leverage to hold her in default, which basically stated that there was a minimum hours of operation, which meant that she must be open from Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, right? And every Saturday. And unfortunately, in her situation, she was not. And she was closed on Wednesdays and open every second Saturday. And that landlord used that small little loophole, and that doctor was forced to relocate. Absolutely devastating. All of which could have been prevented, right, with specifically aligning the lease to the type of business. But even though, right, your lease does not have COVID language, you might, as many doctors have, because they've been closed, right, the landlord has still sent them that default notice. Regulatory, we touched on. Obviously, each area is a little different. So if you've got specific areas, specific questions about your specific state, province, county, etc., lots of uniqueness between New Mexico to LA County to aspects of Ontario. That's a whole cross section. Western Canada. We've been involved, one of my partners is involved with the Alberta Dental Society with reopening. So we're very familiar with a lot of specific requirements, air filtration, of course, closing off operatories we're seeing a lot of, and seeing some pretty unique photos of doctors' offices. So let me circle back on this. The next major issue is those that are in a month-to-month lease, which astonishingly is about 20% of those on the call. So from that perspective, a month-to-month lease, doctors, well, you might think that's fantastic and it gives me all the freedom and I can walk away and like a get out of jail free card kind of thing, a monopoly. Quite frankly, it's the opposite. It has left us completely exposed, and it can yield a significant challenge, meaning that the landlord within 30 days notice can exercise, as can you, the ability to terminate the lease and walk away. However, if you have value, right, and you're looking to sell, what are we selling? And if we don't have a lease that we can transfer, then the new tenant can go directly to the landlord, secure a new lease. And let me ask you the question, if you're selling your practice without the location, what's that practice worth? So let me say that again, right? If you're selling your practice, if the buyer shortcuts you, goes directly to the landlord behind your back, negotiates a new lease to take over your space in 30 or 60 days time, and then comes back to you to say, well, I've already got the location. Now, how much for your charts and gear, right? That could impact hundreds of thousands of dollars in the sale of your practice. So the month-to-month lease, again, coming back in and back to work and thinking everything's normal on a month-to-month basis is a problem. In addition to that, for those of you following along, the holdover or overholding section of your lease is specific that states that if you go beyond the initial term of your lease, you're in holdover status, which in most cases, the landlord can increase the rent by 150% to 200% and can back bill you all the way back to the first month that you became a month-to-month tenant. So you might be thinking, hey, you know what? My landlord hasn't raised my rent, or I'm getting away with something. Trust me, especially in situations where landlords change hands, or if the landlord's trying to sell their building, part of any of that due diligence, they can come back and realize, whoops, we've been undercharging. And we've seen many examples. One, over $36,000 in Northern California, where a new landlord came in and found out that everyone was on a triple net lease, and they had only been billing them as if it was a gross lease. So they reapplied all the property taxes, $26,000 for a doctor. Another one in central Canada, right? Building was going for sale, and as a result, there was a significant amount of back taxes to be assessed. So all of these things are a challenge, and therefore it can be very important to understand what's in the lease, right? Understanding and cross-referencing what we have been paying for, and to make sure that we are strategizing ourselves for the future. Another big mistake that we're seeing throughout the country now is a missed opportunity. And again, with COVID and with landlords, most who are still reeling with lost profits, lost proceeds, or in some cases, landlords going bankrupt because of the tenants going bankrupt, especially those that are heavily anchored with retail, or restaurants or pubs or others that haven't made a single rent payment. In many cases, the landlords are in a very weakened position, and it gives you incredible advantage to be leveraging with that landlord, to be renegotiating not only the financials, but also could be a good opportunity to switch the named tenant from your name personally to the corporation who owns the practice, that owns the practice. So the ability to transfer to reduce some of the liabilities are key, as well as to strengthen your position upon sale or prevent you from returning the practice to pre-dental condition and having to demolish it if you're walking away through the surrender clause, which we'll touch on. So in many cases, some doctors have just paid, or the landlord, brushed them off, and now they've missed a significant opportunity. In addition to that, lease deferrals and abatements. If you have not received any help from the landlord, for the most part, you are in the minority. Most landlords have offered some sort of a deferral or delay or other aspects to help from a cash flow perspective. If you have not, it doesn't preclude you from negotiating something in the future. Just because you've received your PPP loan or other government incentive doesn't stop you from still negotiating deferrals for October, November, December, and making sure that you've got adequate cash as we come back. In addition to that, especially, right, if your lease is coming due in the next 30 months, I strongly suggest to have your lease reviewed, which will give you options for in the end. Specifically though, because that does give great leverage, and the old negotiation rule book is out the window. COVID really has shaken things up and has given, in many cases, the tenant far more control and leverage than they've had in years. I mean, this is very similar, talking to some of the major banks, RBC, Bank of America, and others, right? This is very similar to what we saw in 2008. And for those of you that got into a lease or a property in 2008, right, everything was very unique. We got a very low lease rate. We were able to get favorable terms. Construction was low, right? The interest rates were low. Sounds pretty similar to today. I mentioned those personal guarantees and continuing liability. Most of you might be unaware that post-sale, you will still remain personally and or continually liable. So even, let me say that again. So even after you've sold the practice, in the assignment and subletting section, what it'll in essence say is that regardless of what happens, and regardless of the landlord approving you to sell your practice to Dr. Smith, that the assignment and transfer of that lease will not relieve the liability that you will have. So in essence, you will still be a personal guarantor for your buyer in perpetuity. So this may come as a bit of a shock and surprise for some, but this is absolutely in that assignment and subletting section and is something that can be negotiated away. It just takes the right language, and it takes the, again, following the best practices to help leverage your situation to get the best favorable results. In addition to that, your neighbors are taking advantage of it. Your neighbors are pushing the landlord hard. You should too, right? You shouldn't be the only one that's just paying your rent on time, floating the landlord's mortgage, right? When you are one of their best and most favorable tenants. So, all right. So we're going to give some more time for Q&A here. Again, encourage you, again, for the significant amount that are joined here this evening, the Q&A section, feel free to post as we go, and we'll cover those throughout as well as towards the end. A lot of questions. So, boy, is this ever bringing in some crossroads. So relocating and selling, or just walking away. So let's talk about that for a second. Very interesting, right? Lots of doctors, if you have started your practice back when wet finger dentistry was actually wet finger dentistry, no different than my godfather back in the early 80s. I remember being in the chair and no latex gloves back then. So those were the sign of the times. And now to be in full PPE gear and hot and shields, and there's a lot of doctors that have been contemplating transitioning and are now wondering, is now the time? And can I do it? And am I up for it? Can I walk away? And is now the time? So you've really got to do a bit of soul searching to say, why? What am I really trying to accomplish? And one thing I can stress is, as you're doing the soul searching and as you're contemplating, as many are, be cautious, because we are seeing an uptick of those that are contemplating to exit or contemplating to walk away and just be done with it. So in some cases, it's not that easy. And secondly, gosh, you've invested so much time, energy, and effort into your business. To just walk away from one of the largest assets in your portfolio, the practice, it's disheartening to hear doctors say that. So it depends. Each situation is unique, but you've really got to find out what your goals are. How can you see yourself forge ahead? And for the most part, if you can see yourself getting back in and revisiting this in a year or so from now and keeping production up and getting back on track, then the multiples and the valuations are back up to normal, right? And it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Don't kick yourself by making a rash decision now. Relocation. So we touched on that. Worked with a few doctors, some of which in major strip malls or plazas, many of which were paying astronomical rates for rent, some of which were over 20% of revenue was coming and was going out in rent. That is incredibly high. So I would encourage you for a few things. Number one is look at how much am I paying in rent divided by the total amount of revenue and collections you brought in last year. If your average, right, so again, let me say it again, the amount that you're paying in rent today, so total rents, total tenancy expense, divided by your total revenue for 2019, total collections. That should be about 8.23% on average. If it's greater than that, we either have a production problem or a rent problem. If it's lower, great, right? The practice could technically afford a little higher rent and still be very healthy and aligned with national averages. So the relocation has to be a reason for it. If it's a bad relationship with the landlord, if they've been trying every option to get you out, if there's ever been a time to peel off the Band-Aid and move across the street, now could be the time when landlords are desperate to fill those vacant properties and pay for tenant improvement allowance or otherwise. We had a great relocation story in Northern California. We were able to relocate the doctor who tried 3 times to sell. We were able to relocate her about 10 minutes north, and the landlord covered the entire cost of the build out. So it doesn't have to be stressful and complicated as long as you align yourself with the right people and the professional team. So relocation, again, could be a great opportunity. How do you make the decision to relocate unless you know 2 things? Number one is, what's the best possible deal for the landlord to keep me, right? Because they don't want to lose you. And then secondarily is, what's the best possible deal for the space across the street, right? So ultimately, to determine the relocation, you can't get the data until you've negotiated both sides of the coin, right? We have to get those best possible rates moving forward. So number 3, walking away. So lots of conversations here, lots in their late 50s, 60s, or even 70s now saying, what am I doing all this for? So I understand. I certainly can empathize after all the years of being a business owner and fighting through, and then COVID comes. What a devastating end to a long, hard-fought career. The walk away, though, be cautious, right? The lease becomes very important. And is there term left on the lease, right? That's a big component. If there's term, then there is significant liability and or personal liability, so it might not be that easy. And depending on who the next tenant is, in the surrender section or restoration section of your lease agreement is specifically will dictate if and how you have to remove any or all leasehold improvements, including the medical grade electrical and plumbing upon your exit. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, another dentist I'm sure is going to probably gobble this up. But if they don't, you better believe the landlord is going to be looking to come after you rather than paying the $5,000, $10,000, or $15,000 to demolish it in preparation for whatever tenant is willing to take over that space. So walking away, as much as we might be thinking about it, it might not be that easy. The lease is key. And of course, selling. So a vast majority, that ADA stat, it was over 15% are now thinking of selling in the next 6 months. So be cautious, because obviously a lot that were thinking about it before are kicking themselves and they didn't accept the value that was proposed pre-COVID. So selling can still be an option. But again, the lease and the landlord is a key linchpin. And as you know, you cannot sell your practice without the assignment of the lease. Usually the purchase and sale agreement is predicated on the transfer of the lease, as well as the financing. And of course, financing now, many of the lenders are in a bit of a hold pattern just due to the amount of requirements the PPP and other elements have impacted. So if you're looking to sell, your buyer pool may be diminished based on just current economic climate. So selling is a key piece. If you are, lease will really dictate if and whom you can sell your practice to. And for example, if you have less than a few years left on the lease, then it can be very difficult for the buyer to get financing. Most lending institutions, if they are to give you $1 million or your buyer $1 million loan, they will not give a 10-year payback period without an equivalent payback period of the lease, meaning that they want the lease to be coterminous or longer than the payback period of the loan. And it makes sense. A lot of the landlords, or the lenders rather, have been burned because of the fact that they have given a loan to a doctor, they bought the practice, they got in, and suddenly 2 years later, either the lease expired or the options were not transferable. And suddenly now the doctor's out needing another couple $100,000 to build out a space next door. So term, right, can be very helpful in the sale of the practice. So a couple of core things to summarize here before we get to some Q&A. Number one is your office location is the foundation of your practice. It really creates either the rock solid concrete foundation or a crumbling shell that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix down the road. If you've failed to pay or there's still outstanding amounts, right, that can be catastrophic to your reopening strategy, especially if in default. The cost to build and relocate or invest, right, is staggering. It is higher than any other commercial tenant. It can be incredibly difficult and expensive to obviously move. The sale is obviously predicated on it, but ultimately the lease, right, gives you leverage with the landlord, especially if you're coming up for renewal. What should the lease do? Ultimately, a few things. Number one is it should be fair and equitable market rents. And if it's not, and if you've Googled your address for a lease, right, you might find that you're paying $18 a square foot and they're advertising $15 a square foot to the vacant property next door. Unbelievable. Right? Why? Because they're looking at you as their bread and butter and their paycheck, and they're just trying to attract based on market for the vacant space. So you want fair and affordable rents. You want, typically, I always strongly suggest, depending on the situation, a nice 10-year term with 2 5-year options. Right? For the 76% of you that are staying put, right? Term, continuity, predictability. If COVID's taught us one thing, it's that the unexpected can happen, and focusing on minimizing risk and exposure. And part of that is through the death and disability clause. So one of the things that helped us get our reputation 26 years ago was something called the death and disability clause, dental specific language that if, heaven forbid, something were to happen to you or your ability to practice dentistry, you or your estate would have the ability to either A, terminate the lease, or B, ensure you're not held in default, considering you, the tenant, are no longer with us. And your estate would need to either renew the lease or prepare the lease for sale. So that's minimizing risk and exposure, maximizing your flexibility, right? Ensuring that you've got term options and transferable options so that if, for whatever reason, post-COVID, there's a shift, and this area isn't what it used to be, it gives you options to change or relocate. And then, of course, here can enhance your ability to eventually sell the practice. Okay, this is the section we usually have the most questions on, as well as some of the best conversations. So from that perspective, when looking at what to look out for in the lease, there's a number of components that come around, especially with COVID. A lot of questions we get are, Eric, what are you guys doing now? Are you guys adding in pandemic language? What are you guys doing post-COVID? So the short answer is no, but definitely we're looking through these clauses and looking to prepare for the unexpected, such as state of emergencies, forced closures, etc., especially those for new starts, where termination language and delay language, we are absolutely adjusting, especially in a post-COVID world. The alterations section, again, we've discussed that at length. Please read that. And if you are making any material changes, right, typically you will need landlord's written consent. And please, doctors, if your lease is coming due, for the vast majority that's coming due in the next 2 years, don't spend a whack of money and have your lease come due in a year or so. Landlords love it. Why? Because great, Dr. Goldberg, fantastic. Thank you for investing $40,000 into your space. Your lease is coming up next year, and here's your new rental rates. Now that I know you're not going anywhere, congratulations. So I strongly suggest that if your lease is coming due, why are you paying for all these changes? Every dollar you put into the space becomes property of the landlord. Why don't you get the landlord to pay for it? So, just like we did with Dr. Sam Thatcher, who's a dentist for the San Francisco Giants, he gave us a great video reference and case study. We were able to get him almost $8,000 of tenants improvements just for renewing his lease. And that was for carpeting, flooring, etc. So be smart. Don't make investments in the space without renegotiating the lease, especially if it's coming due in the next few years. And then secondarily is be smart, right? Landlords usually have some budgets for a tenant improvement allowance or TI or TIA. So use that to your advantage. Fixturing period, similarly, if you're opening up a new practice, you should have at least 6+ months to be able to fixture or build out your practice. Again, if you're building out a practice, we usually get an additional 3 months worth of free rent. So that's 6 months to build out without rent. And then even after the lease is commenced, it is 3 free months, right? So again, we're not brokers. We're not getting commissions from the landlord. We're not, we're not out trying to find the way for you to pay more, right? You need to have someone on your team that's just looking out for your best interests. A couple of additional components here: continuous operation, we touched on, that was the hours of operation. Assignment and subletting upon sale. Demolition, relocation, those are big now. Many landlords, believe it or not, in the actual assignment, in the lease amending agreement, to allow for the tenant to have 2 months of deferred rent, the landlord, large institutional landlord, sent through a response that was over 12 pages. Again, for just deferring rent, they got a 12-page lease amendment, and hidden in there was personal indemnification, like a personal guarantee that the doctor didn't have before. And also, the landlord also put in a demolition right, hidden in exchange of a lease deferral. The landlord was very, very, I don't even know the word, but was very unique, to say the least, to try to put that in. So, and I'll bet a lot of doctors signed it. So very important, doctors, don't sign anything without having someone review it first, right? Especially from a professional lease perspective. And then be cautious. Demolition and relocation could bring hundreds of thousands of dollars of risk, or could really impact the ability to sell. Banks hate demolition clauses. And if in your lease it states that within a 3-month or 2-month or 1-month period, the landlord can say, yeah, we're thinking of redeveloping, so you're out. That can have major impacts and completely stop the sale of your practice. The solution, well, we put in blackout clauses, delays. We can make sure that it can't be used until the landlord's actually received city approval or county approval, or basically that the shovels are driving in. So there's lots of ways of doing it. Or if they are within a certain period of time, then they have to pay you back a certain amount, which we've had a lot of success with. Okay. A couple of final points here. Death and disability we spoke on. Surrender, overholding. Again, if you're in a month-to-month basis and you're in overholding, that's the section to look out for. You could be responsible for 150% or 200% of base rent if you're outside of the term. Personal guarantees. For those of you that are unaware, if you've signed your lease personally, and I won't do a poll question on that, but if you signed your lease personally, or if you have agreed to a personal guarantee, then this gives the landlord the ability to come after yourself and any personal assets individually, right? Leapfrog your corporation and come directly after you. And again, that can only make a bad situation much worse. So hopefully that covers financial statements. Lots of landlords asking for financials. If you did not, and in your lease, it states that you must within a 15-day period, then you may be in default, because if you asked for some free months or otherwise, and the landlord requested financials, have a look. in your lease if there's a financial statements requirement, and you can be held in default if you don't send them your tax returns or bank statements, both personally and corporately. So again, please be aware of what's within the lease. If you have any questions on those, again, strongly suggest here momentarily, there'll be a quick poll, as well as the ability to request a complimentary lease review. This, in the essence of time, is found in over 75% of the leases out there for those on the line. This is the assignment and subletting. Very relevant now post-COVID, that this dictates if and how we can sell the practice. And a couple of components, as we mentioned, we cannot sell without the prior written consent of the landlord to transfer the lease. The second section in orange here, it states that even after the landlord has agreed to transfer, or sorry, just for asking, the landlord shall A, approve the tenant's request to assign, B, decline the tenant's request to assign the lease and sell the practice, or 3, to terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment. So you heard that right. Just for asking, the landlord can terminate the lease. Also another one here, that even after you transfer the lease, the landlord shall have the ability to revise the minimum rent and to increase it to either the greater than the current market rent or 15% greater than the current rent. So lots of aspects here, again, in the essence of time. This is just one clause of one section within the lease that can have, again, dramatic impact to your lease agreement and to the viability and the reopening of your practice. So to summarize, 24 to now, we're seeing up to about 30, 32 months is a great window to start the negotiation process. Time is leverage. One thing I can say from a guarantee is that typically the more time we have to negotiate the deal, the better it is and the more leverage you have, because the landlords want to wait. So this is what landlords get taught, this tenant lease cycle. So what it shows is 24 months is the best time to start for the tenant. What do you do when you reach out to the landlord? The landlord says, heck, you know what, too busy, it's too soon, let's wait, let's delay. 12 months comes by, oh, I'm golfing. 8 months, oh no, it's a busy time, right? And then suddenly you get to 6 months or 3 months out when you have to give the landlord written notice of your ability to exercise the lease. And most landlords, right, will be unresponsive. Will wait for your option to renew deadline to pass. Your remaining options then become null and void, and they've got all complete control, and now they can do whatever they want. Rental rates, they can give you a new lease. So the big takeaway, doctors, is don't wait. The earlier you start, the better. And principally, about 24, and now in some cases even longer, is the best time to start. So, a couple of key things that we're seeing is don't miss this unique opportunity to renegotiate with the landlord. Don't miss this opportunity to be renegotiating rents. Some of the states in the southern U.S. that have been open for multiple weeks now, they've got amnesia, right? And also some of the prairie provinces as well, right? Landlords are forgetting COVID quickly. So for those of you that still have landlords in a precarious situation, leverage it. Take some action now. If your lease expires, be smart, right? If you're making changes, you don't have to bear all those expenses yourself. Make sure you get written approval. And then also think about you. Think about how you can leverage this and, like other tenants, get a much better deal. So again, an unprecedented opportunity now for those looking to hunker it out and look forward, or those looking to sell. Great opportunity to be renegotiating the lease to prepare for sale, or to give us the protection we need moving forward. Just like if we could go back and reset rents back in 2008. What a great opportunity to do so, right? Don't look back midsummer and a few months from now and saying, shoot, I only wish I knew what my rents would have looked like had I started to negotiate then. A lot of new starts have hired us recently. It is very unique that landlords are very anxious to fill those vacant properties, let alone with a dentist who's about to spend $200 a square foot to build out. It is incredible. The equipment suppliers, there are deals like there's never been before. And of course, the banks. The banks now, as soon as they reopen, and sort of start the process for brand new existing approvals, etc. The rates have never been lower. So again, a lot of questions. A few of the Q&As here are about rents, which I'll touch on shortly. Very unique. Right? We track over 95 billion square feet. We have 4.6 million properties that we're tracking, and we can basically pull up title searches, basic demographics, vacancies, rental rates, the whole nine. So definitely, if you have any questions about fair and equitable rents, shoot us a note, request a lease review, and we're happy to schedule that. In addition, the last component here is how. Right? Eric, how do I make sure that the landlord listens to me? How can I get the results? How can I get these improvements? This, after over 26 years of doing this, here's what we found. Number one is get all the information. And don't be nervous about it, right? Part of PPP, due diligence, everyone's asking for a copy of the lease. Email if you don't have an executed, countersigned copy of your lease, it isn't worth the paper it's written on. I strongly implore you to email your landlord immediately and state that, right, you're digitizing your records, or, to make sure that you have all the allocated documentation for some of the government programs you've applied for, to please send you a digital copy of a countersigned copy of your lease. They will send that back to you within the hour. Therefore, and then know exactly what you've signed off on or what they think you've signed off on. If you can't remember, they will have full copies, trust me. Number two is identify all the goals, practice, and objective. Number three is review, right, the Office for Risks, prepare all the market research, right, do your homework, and then determine the goal. Right? And without that, what most doctors do is skip through 1 through 5 and go right to picking up the phone and calling the landlord. And hey, let's talk about rent. Right? Missing the first 5 steps and completely missing the mark, and then it's exactly where the landlord wants you. Please don't be one of those doctors. Don't make the biggest mistake of just picking up the phone and calling the landlord. Do your homework first. Understand what's in your lease, develop a plan, develop the end game, right? Get all your data, and then start the negotiation process. Focus on financials, focus on the business terms, and get to a final form lease you're happy with. So we're going to pull up a quick poll. Again, lots of additional questions I'm going to cover here shortly, but in appreciation of your time, we will do a complimentary lease review and rental rate analysis. So the poll question is just up here. Number 1 is, are you a tenant today? Number 2 is, again, when does your lease expire? 12 months, 24 months, 36 months within. If your situation is urgent, and if you're month to month, please note that your situation is urgent. We will prioritize that lease review. Happy to help many of you personally, if you'd like, or one of certainly the members of my senior consulting team. If you're interested in a complimentary lease review, that's where to request. And also, if you're looking to start or buy a practice in the next year, great section there for number 5. So we'll take a quick minute to fill out the poll, and then we'll dig into some interactive Q&A. So as those of you are going through some questionnaires, some good questions about HEPA filters, HVAC, vent requirements prior to opening. So it depends is the short. Most have specific requirements that can be done through an external HVAC, or it can be done through an enhanced filter process. It depends on your setup. It depends on the airflow. Does your airflow, is it contained to your unit, or does it go between your unit and the Chinese restaurant next door, right? There's a lot of questions there, but in essence, most have some requirement to help decrease the likelihood of the virus or other impacts, airborne impacts in the space. So it depends on your specific area regarding those specific regulations. In addition to that, good question here from Jimmy. Selling dentist signed a new lease for 5 years with no option to renew, does not want buying dentist to negotiate with landlord and will do the assignment without buying dentist involved. The landlord is studying the long-term perspective for the building. Is this a problem? Sort of asking the question, knowing the answer. So yeah, I see that. So I think there's a little more to that story. So happy to go through. But I think the question now is, doctors contemplating selling, is signing or signed a lease with no option to renew. The buyer is going to have to assign the lease. Now, if they don't want to, let's say the landlord's going to sell or may want the doctor out after 5 years, then you're right. It is better to negotiate with the landlord, to negotiate with term and options, saying, hey, you know what, here's my plan for the future and I want as much term as I can. That is usually more, it's easier to accomplish with the existing dentist who's been there for years than it is for a new start doctor that the landlord might have some concerns with. So, short answer is, if you are selling, in generality, term and options and transferable options are key. There is going to have to be an assignment, right? So there is, as a condition of sale, there will have to be a transferring of the lease. But if you have not signed the lease yet, then certainly very important to be renegotiating it in preparation for sale. So for those contemplating of selling, very important to minimize personal liability, minimize continuing liability, amending the assignment and subletting section to be very clear as to whom you can sell to and limit the condition that the landlord can choose who they assign the lease to. Also very important to have some death and disabilities and some exits, heaven forbid, and relieving of some of that liability from the lease. So a number of components there to be aware of upon sale. Some other good questions here, as I'll put up my contact information. Lots of vast majority are all still on, so we'll continue to handle some great questions. So another question here is, if you have a lease with several 5-year options and you start negotiating 2 to 3 years before your current lease expires, how can you know if market cost per square foot will go up or down? Well, Maureen, that's a great question. There's a few components there. Let me be clear. Number one is, we principally suggest against, depending on your situation, but I typically suggest against just exercising an option. Because just exercising an option means that you agree to everything within the lease agreement with the exception of rent. So just by exercising that option really misses a great opportunity and leverage to renegotiate. I would much rather, and then plus, if you're going to sell the practice, you're now exercising 1 or 2 of your 5-year options. You're now like a pirate walking to the end of the gangplank. There's less and less term. So when you go to sell, now suddenly we've got a problem, because what we had was a 10-year term with 2 5s or a 5-year with 2 5s, right? Suddenly we're about to sell and whoops, we've only got 5 years left or 7 years left or 2 years left. So term and options are key. So yes, starting 2 years prior, and don't just exercise your option. Quite frankly, you want to get your renegotiation done prior to the option to renew deadline date. That is the date that you should put in your calendar, that you have to give the landlord written notice of your intent to stay. But that again means the guns to your head and that you agree to everything with the exception of rent. Far better strategy, start early, start a new lease, right? Or amending the current lease, but give yourself the time that you can have your cake and eat it too. Meaning to negotiate a new deal before that option to renew deadline comes up. But then the question is, how do we know it's going to go up or down? So the short answer is you don't. That's part of the uniqueness of where we're at. However, as we've seen from history, the trend line usually continues to go up, right? Just like death and taxes. There's fluctuations, but principally with COVID, right? Even if things get worse before they get better, and the real estate market gets worse before it gets better, then we can still be renegotiating in a non-binding way, and nothing you're locked into until you've signed. So, again, from that perspective, COVID has created a very unique opportunity where landlords are feeling pressure that they've never felt before and are open to making changes and improvements to the lease that they wouldn't have pre-COVID. So you've definitely got some great leverage. If you have not exercised your option, or you're coming due in the next year or 2 years or 2.5 years, definitely suggest requesting a complimentary lease review. When you exit, there's also another form that you can fill out if you missed the poll, or you can email myself or the team here at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, or give us a call, extension 3258, and we'll schedule a complimentary lease review. And happy to, again, discuss and go through any specific situations personally. And again, ladies and gentlemen, you're not alone. It is a very confusing and challenging time, I know, but also it is also the time to help ensure that we're partnering with making sure that we know what we're up against. We're assembling our professional team to do what they should, and to make sure that we are giving ourselves the ability to get back to work, get the revenues back up, and make sure that none of this COVID issue comes back to bite us down the line. Okay, so from that perspective then, I'll keep this open for the next few minutes for any additional questions, and happy to go through any specific situations. There's the chat feature, as well as there's the section for Q&A. And lots of you obviously in leases today, looking at the summary. Many of you, leases are coming due within the next few months, and especially the next 24 months. And definitely for those that have referenced urgency, we'll certainly focus on that shortly afterwards. Great. So on that note, we'll keep the Q&A section open a little longer, but I greatly appreciate everyone's time. All the best to you and your family. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we certainly appreciate your time this evening, and let us know if we can help in any way. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, so we can stop some of our recordings here. Another question that has came in through the chat. One moment.